Well, hey there. Thanks for tuning in. This is the Resonant Identity, a podcast where we explore ways to help you achieve transformation and flourishing in line with identity-aligned living and coherence. I'm your host, Terrence Waters, CEO and founder of FlexSign Resonance Group and creator of the Resonance Core Framework, of which this podcast is based off of. If you find this work resonates with you, I invite you to follow the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio Podcasts, Spreaker, or wherever you get your podcast. And please feel free to share it with people that you care about and resonate with. And a quick note just before we begin, AI was used to help me generate this episode, and every part of it was reviewed and verified by me before publication. And while I'm definitely a human speaking to you and working with you in this podcast, the content that we write and share, along with our website, sources, and information we use, was generated using AI. At FlexSign, we advocate for responsible, transparent AI usage and take full accountability for the content that we share here and across our platforms. To learn more, you can visit flexline.pro/legal. And in today's topic, we're going to be talking about distortion and its role that it plays in identity alignment, plus also the processes of seeking truth to ensure that we align with the correct options for identity alignment. So hey, let's go ahead and get started. The information presented in this episode also comes from various philosophical and psychological resources, along with various chapters that will be in our forthcoming book called the Resonance Core Framework, involving the window of choice, somatic cues, emotional cues, and interpretive hygiene. You can find these information and sources in our show notes. So what we'll be talking about first is really what it means to understand what is reality, to understand how it can sometimes be shrouded in distortion, and how we can find ways to being able to address those issues so that we are making our decisions and aligning ourselves in terms with truth, while also being cognizant of when we do experience distortion, what to do with it. We'll also be going over what it means to talk about the mechanics of subjective experience as we start to relate to many of the different cues that we experience as we start to encounter information that may go against our worldview. We'll also talk about the differences between truth and distortion so that way we can be cognizant of them. And we'll also be discussing what's called the triad of personal experience, which is applying logic, emotion, intuition, and self-identity to the information that we receive so that way we can be cognizant of that information. We'll also be learning about a topic from the Resonance Core Framework called interpretive hygiene, which is what we can use, a step-by-step narrative process that helps us understand all the different things that we experience when we start seeing things like facts, opinions, and so forth, and a step-by-step process of what we can use to help us discern truth and distortion within that information we receive. And then, of course, we'll go over a 7-day challenge, which we always do, which is understanding your identity definitions and applying interpretive hygiene to them so that you can start to understand the differences between what it is you believe in and some of the things that may be shrouded in distortion. And so we'll be going through all of these processes today and then giving you a preview of what is to come as we start understanding more about the resonant identity. So first, let's go ahead and do a reflection, because last episode, as you recall, we were learning about inner alignment, and in order for us to be able to do that, we needed to be able to first identify and understand our own identity. That includes past, present, and future, based on how we have seen ourselves, how we see ourselves today, and how we assume we will be for ourselves in the future, which is what we're working toward. So first, I want to reflect on that 7-day challenge. It is a little difficult, if you really think about it, to be able to find yourself. We know ourselves in some ways. We do have ideas, aspirations, goals of who we want to become. But probably this exercise may have been a little more difficult as you were really asked to face and understand those goals, right? Because it happened for me when I was really trying to understand who I wanted to be and who I am becoming. And so I want you to reflect on it and thinking on just a couple of these things. While you were going through the 3 options of past, present, and future, how did it make you feel? What were the things that really came into your mind as you were really trying to put thoughts and ideas down on the paper? Why was it easy for you? Or maybe why was it also difficult in some areas? And then how did it really help you better understand your identity when you really had to put those into words? Again, past, present, and future. And as you were doing so, did you notice differences, conflicts, confusion, things that just didn't seem to make sense as you were starting to write things down? And maybe things that actually went against each other, maybe in the past and the present. And then finally, did you just notice some conflict in yourself that required you to really pause and reevaluate what it is that truly mattered? Did you understand some things more about yourself as you started going through that process that maybe made you realize that you may not 100% realize exactly who you are? Now, the reason I say this is because this introduces us to this next topic, which is distorted reality. And the reason I say that is because our mind, our body, and our emotions, all three, have this idea of who it thinks we are, but may or may not actually reflect who we are or who we are becoming. We explained this last episode in Inner Alignment, where we talked about how sometimes our thoughts, our actions, our words, and may be misaligned with our emotions and how our body responds to certain stimuli. And that also includes how we think about ourselves, why we think about ourselves, and so on. And so, what is really reality? If we really think about this idea and topic, what this means really is how we have understood ourselves and how we understand our world and how our brains, our minds, and our emotions put together our experience of reality based on our past experience. And so reality, as defined truly by psychology and in the Resonance core framework, it's our experienced consciousness of our lives and our recollection of what happened in our lives based on our interpretation of those events and situations. And what makes that very unique is that we may see a version of information like a fact or an event or how someone responds to us or so on. And based on our point of reference, we may respond or react to that actual event in different ways. And this is because of how we see reality, which may or may not be reflective of really what it is. So think of it this way. When you try to come up with what you did yesterday, your mind is going through a timeline of kind of the events of what you did. Maybe that was driving to work. Maybe that was taking care of your kids or family. But you may not 100% recall everything that actually happened in that moment. And the reason for that is because there are so many things that happen when we experience events, situations, or actions that are shrouded in distortion that may not allow us the ability to fully recollect what happened. And sometimes we may judge that in a way that may actually not be reflective of truth. And the reason for that is because our brain only has a certain amount of level of consciousness, of capacity, in order for us to being able to understand and recollect what actually happened. While our nervous system and our emotions are given so much more information subconsciously and unconsciously that we're just not able to fully fathom all of it. And that's why we sometimes miss certain cues, events, information that actually gives more context to the situation that may or may not actually be a thing our brains really understand. So here's an example of that. We experience reality in basically the way that we see things, which is called subjective reality in psychology. That means that our perception, our emotions, cues, and memory are the ones that actually take that information, shroud it based on our past experience, like I mentioned before. And the problem with this is that because could be shrouded in distortion or false memories, because of what our brains do, it is possible that the information we actually are recalling is actually not based in reality. And this is very well known in psychology because of our recall process. Our brains can only hold so much information at one time and can only process so much information at one time. And because of that, when we store information in short and long-term memory, when we try to recall it, most of the time it's shrouded in past experience and other memories that really don't even have anything to do with the situation. That's because our perception of reality is one thing, and is very different from person to person as well, just because of how we all look at the world and experience the world differently. An example of this is when we look at a red apple. Now, this comes actually from a wonderful podcast that I love, which is Stuff You Should Know. One of their episodes called Is Reality Real, which you can find in the show notes. But what they talk about is how a red apple to us may look very different depending on our frame of reference of what we think a red apple might be. So you can picture this in your head, where we can see it on the table, where we're just about to eat it, and we see it as a certain hue or color based on our current version of reality. Now imagine this. Close your eyes for a minute, and then think about what that red apple might look like. In this scenario, this is what a blind person is actually trying to envision, whether or not they've actually have a frame of reference of what a red apple is. They may be able to feel it, they will be able to taste it and understand and even smell it, but will they be able to actually see the color red? The answer is no, right? Because of course they are blind. Let's add a little bit more to this. Let's say a person can see, but they are experiencing red color blindness. What would they then see if they saw that same red apple? They would see a completely different version of it based on their ability of their eyes to being able to discern color. And it gets even more complex when we start adding multiple color blindness to this, which then shows its own version of its own hue. And then even more further. As an example, females typically have the ability of seeing more color than males. And so what we as men might actually see, as an example, a female may actually look at that same red apple and see it in a completely different way. And then let's add even one more interesting idea. Because of how color works, on the spectrum of color that we can see with our naked eye, red happens to be reflected back to our eyes as red, which also means something else, because every single other color that is not red is being absorbed into the apple as a different type of color, which means that the apple itself is actually not red because that color is being reflected off the red apple and not being absorbed by it. That means essentially that we are seeing this color of red when reality is saying it is anything but red, because in other ways, that actually would be absorbed and we would be reflected to a different color if it was red, which even adds some more interesting dynamics to it. This happens to be how physics and color work, but our minds and our eyes, based on previous experience of evolution of things, we actually experience color in the form of red because we see it as something that is desirable, something that will give us health, nourishment, and so on. These again are just theories, but this is something that is very interesting as we start to understand reality. Our experience is only based on our interpretation and perception of really what is happening around us. And that's why whenever you hear the phrase perception does not equal reality, that's exactly what it means. We may experience reality in some way, shape, or form, but our perception and our interpretation of it are what is left to the eye, and that is specific to only us. If you want to see this more, we've created a little bit of a demo on the Fluxline Resonant ID website as well, where you can see this in action and see how some people actually might perceive what the red apple might look like in these different scenarios. So it gives you a little bit more of a frame of reference to push this down. We're going to add one more example to this before we go to break, but we're going to talk about what's called the 6x9 interpretation, which is also available on our website. And this one's a very common meme that many of us have probably seen in social media or on the internet. But essentially what it is you have two people that are standing on opposite ends of a number on the floor, and they're pointing at it and seeing it in two different ways. From one point of view, the person sees it as a 6 because from their point of reference, that's what it looks like. And the other person standing on the other side of it sees it as a 9 because from their point of view, it actually shows as a 9. But here's the kicker. Who in this case is actually true? Who is actually seeing the information as it is? And this is going to be the tricky part that is very hard to accept, but very important that we understand. Both people are actually truthful because they are seeing the actual number based on their own reality. That is their perception of the experience because they perceive this number according to their viewpoint as either a 6 or a 9. And in our case, we could see it both ways. This could be a 6 or a 9. So from our perspective, we are also correct, right? Because this is a 6. It could be a 9. It could be both. But that person who is seeing it from their reality sees it based in truth. However, this is where the other kicker comes into play, is that the fact of what that number actually is lies dependent on the person who has actually painted that number on the floor. So that number had to get there somewhere. Whoever created that number and painted it had a very distinct number in mind. And it's our job to understand the truth from our distortion in order to be able to understand, is that a 6 or is it a 9? And we would need to go and find the person who painted it to being able to understand their actual fact. And this is the truth in how we understand truth and distortion. Because we really do see various different things from our perception and our reality from how we see the world. But what is actually the truth, the 6 or the 9, depending on what the person painted, is really up to fact, which we really need to understand what that truth is so that we can correct our distortion and ensure that it comes from a foundation of truth. So in other words, we may experience some form of reality or thought that could be shrouded in distortion because we don't have all the nuance and information that we need to make that decision. And so what it is our job to understand how we really get to the bottom of what is happening and understanding what actually is truth so that we can base our assumptions and our perceptions in that truth rather than coming from distortion. And we're back. Thanks for listening. So this next section, we're just going to expand on that understanding of distortion and reality and understand about what the subjective experience really looks like in terms of how it happens in our minds and in our bodies. Now, the next topics that we're going to be discussing, please be aware that this is part of a custom framework that we are building at Fluxline called the Resonance Core Framework. The tricky part about doing this is that when we are trying to introduce you to various topics that are philosophical, psychological, and scientific in nature, let's be honest here, they suck. They're hard to read. They're hard to understand. There's a lot of information and very much technical detail that makes it very difficult to really be able to describe all these terms. So what we do in the Resonance Core Framework is instead, we take those technical concepts, terms, theories, etc., that we describe a little bit, but we then shroud them in what's called mythical technical knowledge. And if you think about it, mythic really just simply means story. So we really replace a lot of those terms, the technical stuff, the jargon, all that crazy stuff. And we look at it and we say, how can we make this more memorable so that you can remember what all of these terms mean without having to remember all this scientific mumbo jumbo? We can leave that to the experts. We love them, we appreciate what they do, and we love their research. But for our purposes of identity alignment, we need to keep this a lot more focused inward and make it more relatable. And so what we do in the Resonance Core Framework is we give you mythic terms specifically that describe what all of these things are, because we'll use them over and over and over again as we start going into further episodes. And you'll also see this in the book that happens later in the year once that gets published. So what we're going to talk about is the mechanics of subjective experience, which is relatable in many different areas, but happens almost the exact same way depending on how our bodies and our minds respond to it. So first, when we experience any type of stimulus, so that could be a sensation, that could be what someone says to us, it could be a thought, an emotion, many different things. The body is always the first thing that responds. So when we experience what's called a somatic cue or a body cue, this is how our body reacts before we actually understand what is happening in our minds. This is fully subjective. It always happens because of a response to stimuli. And it usually involves something that is excitable or a threat. And in most cases, what happens is our body tries to take that information and respond by sending signals to the rest of our body to deal with the situation. We'll go over this more in a future episode, but just note for now, this is the first gate, is what we call it in the resonance core framework. The first gate of sensory experience. When we experience something, it always starts in the body. We then start to understand it in what are called emotional cues or emotional signals. Cues and signals are basically the same thing, but we call them cues in the RCF. Emotions really are then what color the perception, help us understand a little bit more about what's happening, usually in some form of shadow, indifferent, or light cue, which we'll go over those, what actually that means in the next episode. But just know for now that we usually associate different signals and emotions in positive or negative ways, which in and of itself is usually not what we try to do, but in this circumstance, for what our purposes are for this episode, you experience emotions usually in response to what the nervous system is sending you. And that could be in many different forms: fear, rejection, anger, malice, joy, excitement, all of those things. And then what happens is, as we experience those somatic and emotional cues, our mind then tries to make sense of what is actually happening and creates a story to explain what we're feeling through the chest tightening, through the dilated pupils, through tunnel vision, through the emotional cues that we're experiencing, and so on. And then from there, our minds then start to pull from what's called the vast unknown of our mind, which is the subconscious and unconscious parts of our mind, to try to make sense of what's going on. And that usually is shrouded in the past experiences, which then results in one of two things in the RCF, which is called resonance or dissonance, which are basically signals that tell us if we are aligned with something or if we're misaligned with something. Resonance is one of those things when you truly feel it, you feel it in your core. You don't just simply experience emotions or excitement or so on. You also feel bodily aligned with it. Your mind, it gets excited and is aligned through with it. Your judgments and your thoughts start to align and push you toward doing that action. And the exact opposite happens in what's called dissonance, which is you start to feel a little off, where something either in your emotional or somatic cues just seems to just push you into a different way. And you may feel aligned with it or think about it in some ways, but you may not also think correctly, and you notice this disconnect back and forth. And so when we say that we are inner aligned, that also means that we feel resonance, basically in our somatic, emotional, and narrative cues. And in those areas, when we feel resonance, we actually feel aligned in all three. Dissonance shows that we have some distraction, some distortion, something doesn't feel right in any one of those three areas. And all of them lead us to what is important to us, which is how we decide to action on that subjective experience, or not at all. And we call that in the resonance core framework the window of choice. This is how we take that interpretation and decide how we want to deal with it, what we want to actually action on or not. And the window of choice gives us that understanding of what it is that we want to do in response to our subjective experience. We will go over all of those topics that I just discussed in future episodes more in depth. But just know that for now, that is the process by which we experience reality and how we actually deal with it in our minds, our body, and the way that we decide to make choices. So we're going to now go back to really what it means to experience reality in either the truth that we see or the distortion that may arise from it. And we want to explain the difference between the two. We're not thinking about truth as terms of something that is right. We are not thinking about truth in terms of something that may be truthful. We are trying to understand alignment and misalignment in this case as we talk about truth. It's a little bit different than our typical discussion. But from truth, we describe it as alignment and resonance that we experience from an event or situation when our interpretation of that event remains grounded in reality and unfiltered fact. In other words, truth is that felt resonance with something that we are experiencing that actually remains grounded in the truth of what is happening in that moment, the actual factual data. Because remember that our reality is an interpretation of what is happening around us. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is actually what is the truth, because our reality is very different from person to person. It also means that when we have that interpretation, that it is grounded in raw data, not narrative or not a skewed view of what is happening. And it also means, finally, that when we are resonant with it and we find that truth, it is resonant with our identity and it actually aligns with who we want to become and who we are. That means that resonance itself means that we are aligning that actual action that we are experiencing, we are aligning it with who we are. That is identity alignment in a nutshell. And as you can guess, distortion is exactly the opposite of that. Distortion basically says that we experience misalignment or dissonance from an event or situation where our interpretation of that event is skewed from reality and fact, whether we know it or not. And that is the tricky part about distortion, is that sometimes we may feel that we are aligned with something when in fact it is shrouded in distortion because of our past experience. And the exact opposite is true, by the way, as well. We may experience distortion in some action or event that we have, but it's actually aligned with who we are and who we are becoming because we're experiencing distortion from our past experience. Whereas the actual experience is aligned with who we want to become because those actions embody us and actually push us toward our identity and our self. And so that's where this gets a little tricky, is that distortion is not just simply saying that something is wrong or that the fact of the information that we have needs to be proven. It's nothing like that. That's not up to us to decide. It's up to us to ensure that what we are interpreting and understanding is actually truthful and based in data and fact. And from that, we can then understand, oh, this action or this event is aligned with me because. And so if we experience those misalignments, that's distortion, it doesn't necessarily mean that we want to step away from what we are experiencing because we think we are experiencing dissonance or distortion. Instead, it means for us that we need to pause. We need to understand what these data points are trying to tell us. We need to understand why they are there. And then we need to make an objective call to look at it and say, why could this be aligned or why may it not be? And we'll go over this in future episodes when we start understanding judgments, data loops, and things like that that help us make those decisions and interpretations as we go forward. But to give you a little bit of a preview of what that will look like, and before we go to break, we'll go through our final option here, which is the triad of personal experience. Now, when we experience something, we experience it in multiple ways. That includes the following, and this is attributed to Aristotle based on persuasion, but we adopt this in the resonance core framework and the resonant identity based on how we understand something logically, something emotionally and intuitively, and something aligned with who we are and who we want to become. And we use the three terms that Aristotle gave us back in his time, but we're going to align them and push them into the resonance core framework. That includes logos, pathos, and ethos, which is exactly what I described. When we use the triad of personal experience, these specifically tell us the ways that we need to evaluate something to make sure that it makes sense, that it resonates with us or not, why it doesn't, why it does, and ensuring how we might be able to adopt it as part of who we are and who we are becoming by utilizing the triad so that we can check ourselves, essentially. Think of it like a checks and balances process. So the first component of it, as I mentioned, is logos, and that specifically talks about logic. It says this involves the logic that is associated with the experience we're involved in. And it says, what does the data say about it? What specifically is observable, verifiable, or factual about this actual experience? We then look at the second branch of it, which is pathos, which is emotion and intuition that's associated with it. And that comes down to our somatic and our emotional cues. How do we feel about this experience? What is our body doing as we experience this situation? And do we feel resonance? Do we feel truthful about it? Do we feel drawn to it? Or does it make us pause? Do we kind of experience this gut wrenching or this chest tightening? or this fear or shame about it for some reason. And then the final step of it is ethos, which this one really is more talking about the self. In this case, it involves self-identity alignment, which is based on what the person feels about the situation and how it aligns with their identity. Does it align with who you are? Does it align with who you are becoming? Why does it align with that identity portion of yourself? And what feels congruent with your values and self-concept, or what seems to push them away? What seems to stand in the way of your values, and why is that the case? Now, before we go to break, I want to add one more piece of information. All of the emotions, the somatic cues, the narratives, and so forth, in the resonance core framework and the resonant identity, we refer to those as data points. Basically saying that when we experience an emotion, a bodily signal, or so on, that's all it is. It's just an emotion with no actual meaning behind it. Like, for example, when you experience sadness, you're just simply experiencing sadness. It's different based on the interpretation or meaning that you give to it, which is what makes it negative or positive or so forth. And so if we can learn to first understand that we might be feeling distortion or dissonance, it doesn't always necessarily mean that we push what we're experiencing away. It instead asks us to look at why are we experiencing that? We look at it with clarity and curiosity. And when we do it from that lens, everything simply just seems to fall away. We don't really have to associate ourselves with our cues anymore because these are just simply somatic signals. And that's not the easiest thing to have to hear, by the way, because they can feel very real, especially if they're involving like some hurt or some situations there, right? It's not to say that your experiences are illegitimized or downtrodden or anything like that. That's not the point. The idea is that we can take those cues and really understand the root cause of them and why we're experiencing them so that we can realign them. So hold on for me for just a second because I'll then be giving you a code and a process to being able to apply this triad of personal experience and how we can then take the data points that we have and improve ourselves to realign them into who we are and who we are becoming. That'll happen right after this. Thanks for sticking with me. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a tool that we can use to help us understand those sources of distortion and confusion and ensure that what we are experiencing actually aligns with who we are and who we want to become. And we call this process in the resonant identity and the resonant core framework interpretive hygiene. Basically, what this does, asks us to look into the data that we're receiving from any event, a situation, a thought, a cue, anything, and evaluating it to really understand what it means, why it's there. Now, before we go any further into this process, especially if this is brand new to you, for those of you who may not be aware of self-awareness, presence, grounding, or even how to evaluate your feelings, this process can be very scary. It can be difficult the first couple times. I advise you, I implore you that if you do need to seek out medical professionals, mental health professionals for this, please do so. This is not an easy thing to do, especially if you've not done it before, because you may uncover parts of yourself that may be rather hurtful, may experience trauma, things from our past that really can bring up really difficult memories and experiences to go through. So if at any point this becomes too much, please stop. I definitely will implore you, don't do this on your own if that's something you cannot handle. And there is no harm in asking for help for someone to help you go through this because they can help you be much more aware and understand how to experience things while also not giving into specifically the full experience. So I give that disclosure first before we go forward, just to make sure that you stay safe, because that's our number one goal as always, right? Now, if this is the first time you've done this also, I want you to picture yourself whenever you experience a cue. So that could be anxiety, chest tightening, a thought that feels uncomfortable, an event or situation. I want you to picture yourself like you are a person looking at yourself. You're able to feel the things that you're feeling, but you're not able to indulge in them. So you might be able to experience the anxiety or the frustration or so on, but it also doesn't mean that you're able to fully engulf yourself in those feelings. You're instead observing what is happening. And that actually changes the point of view really well because then you can look at those cues from an objective point of view, not from what you think it is. Because the tricky part is many of our cues are based in our past experiences, which usually do not reflect what it is we're experiencing in the present moment. And so, when we experience those uncomfortable situations, if you remember to take yourself out of it as you're comfortable, of course, ground yourself with meditation, which we'll talk about those in future states, but just getting yourself to a place where you can observe what's happening and ask clarifying questions and curiosity will make this process a lot easier. So when you practice interpretive hygiene over a situation, a data point, or so on, you'll follow these 5 steps in order. And the first one you're going to do is you need to pause and you need to center yourself. Pause the narrative or the thoughts that are currently happening. Notice what your story in your mind is actually trying to tell you. And then take out what the data from the actual information it's giving you from what your mind is actually interpreting about the situation. Now, when I say that, and we'll go over this a little bit more as we start talking about mind narrative reframing, but essentially what it means is all of your stories are based in some root of data, where it came from in some way. You may experience something that says, like, I am a failure. Well, no, that's not necessarily true. But why do you feel that you're a failure? What specifically is going through your mind or what happened that made you feel that way? The second step is then once you've started to understand your cue of your narrative, you're then going to check your emotional and your somatic cues. What is your body doing? Do you feel chest tightening, tunnel vision, shortness of breath? What emotions are you experiencing and what triggered them specifically? Was it something someone said? Was it a thought that you happened to receive that it all of a sudden started pushing you through this loop? And then you're able to evaluate and start asking yourself, well, why am I experiencing these cues? What is going on here? While again, reminding yourself to stay present and focused, breathing, doing things like that to stay in the present moment. And then what you're going to do in step 3 is to validate the data. What do you actually know about the situation? What really did happen based in fact with no actual interpretation attached to it if possible? Is it projection? Is it an assumption that you're pushing through? Do you feel like this has been something that's happened in your past multiple times? Are you starting to see patterns and so on? And then what you will do is you're going to take that data in step 4 and consult the triad that we just talked about to check yourself on everything. What are the facts about the situation in the logos? What feels resonant or dissonant about the situation through pathos? And then what really does align with your identity based on your ethos? Or does it align at all? If you start noticing those things and really objectifying what is happening with yourself, you're then able to really look at it and say, does this serve me or not? Is this really something that I really need to constantly think about multiple times? And then from there, you're able to reconstruct the interpretation by building a narrative that is actually much more grounded in data. So not reactive, not distorting, not identity eroding, but something that actually more aligns with who you are. So maybe you said that you were a failure because you happened to fail a test or something like that. That was just a one-time situation if you really think about it, right? Does that necessarily mean that you were an entire failure for the rest of your life? Of course not. So instead, what you can do is you can say, I'm actually not very good at taking tests, but I did the best that I could to study, and a 73% is better than getting 100%, right? Or something like that. That's just to give you an idea for you to really be able to understand and see that many of our distortions in our narratives are shrouded into an all or nothing circumstance, black or white thinking, like we talked about before, because in most cases, they fail to account for nuance. What's the backstory? What actually did happen aside from just that one event? Did you study well? Did you cram the night before? Have you been studying for weeks? Whatever the case may be. That's okay. But it's important to understand the nuance of every single situation so you can start to look at things from a bigger picture and a third person point of view, like I mentioned, and start to really be able to look into the sources of your distortion and correct them in truth. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to give you your next 7-day challenge. Like I mentioned, we are a self-action podcast. We are not a thing that actually just simply me giving you information and spouting off all these ideas. I want you to action on your identity to become your resonant identity. So in this case, what we're going to do is you're going to take the identity definitions that you did in episode 3, and we're actually now going to apply interpretive hygiene to some of those, to those things about yourself that were not quite 100% clear. Maybe showed a little bit of confusion, maybe showed some opposites or conflicting information that didn't quite make sense to you at the time. And this can be as many as you would like, but I do challenge you to do at least 3 of them just to be able to practice interpretive hygiene. What you're going to do is you're going to pick out those parts where you felt confused and conflicted, and you're going to apply interpretive hygiene to those aspects of yourself. So what makes sense about that part of you, that is part of you or is who you are becoming? Why do the two things conflict? Or why are you experiencing some distortion or somatic or emotional cues when you try to write it down? What friction points came to your mind as you started writing some of those things that you've identified? And then what you want to do is you then want to take the interpretive hygiene process and the triad and reframe those parts of your identity that are established in truth, not distortion. What you do in that case is by truth, we look at all the information minus the interpretation behind it. So that includes just simply looking at it from a factual point of view. Use reconstruction to reinterpret what those distorted views mean and reframe them into more aligned versions of who you believe your resonant identity to be. Because what this then allows you to do is if you start to redefine something so that it actually better aligns and actually feels more aligned, not just in your mind, but in your cues, your emotions, and your body, it will be much easier for you to be able to embody that part of your identity because you are aligned. Those distorted areas will make it more difficult because you'll start to experience friction as you try to live out those principles that are in line with who you are or who you want to become. Your true identity, the person of who you are, is embodied by constant living action. And in order to do that, you need resonance in order to be able to live an identity-filled and evolution and coherent life, which in that case is what we talked about before with inner alignment, which is you need those aspects of yourself consistent, felt in resonant, and through resonant actions, you're then able to make those decisions. And that's what you can then do to ensure the same thing for your future experience, your chosen identity, who you want to become. Because what you do is as you are making decisions in line with who you want to become, you will experience a little bit of distortion, but it's usually from past experience. And if you can identify those past experience distortion sources, those fears, those shame, the chest tightening, and so on, in response to certain ideas or things you may need to do, it'll make it more easier for you to embody and make those actions because you'll then recognize what those tension points are and just recognize them as just distortion from your past life, which doesn't mean anything. So that's what I challenge you for the next 7 days to go ahead and make that happen. And just finally, before we close, I'm just going to give you a preview of the next episode, which is the body keeping the score, which in this case says, from our point of view, decisions always start in the body, not the mind. And it's important for us to understand how they begin and end in relation to our window of choice and how we can then regulate our bodies to ensure that they do not overcome or take over our process of trying to make decisions by using things such as interoception, presence, and grounding to help us calm our cues down so that we can ensure that we are more aware of what's happening around us as we make those decisions. So that'll be in the next episode. Hey, so I really appreciate you coming in and listening to this episode today. And I just want to let you know, hey, if this episode does resonate with you, I invite you again to subscribe, review, and like this on your favorite podcast service and share it with those people that you care about and resonate with. It really does help me out a lot as we try to get this out to more people. You again can find this on Spreaker, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, or X under the hashtag the Resonant ID. And please try to take this week's 7-day experiment and share about it with your results to me and our team where you're a subscriber on social media. Your feedback will always shape future episodes as we start to make things more relevant for you. And thanks for listening to my podcast. I hope we resonated with you and gave you more ways to help you define and live out who you are. Have fun, be safe, know who you are and what you stand for, and make good choices aligned with your resonant identity. Stay safe out there. Goodbye now.